Okay, great. So welcome to Genesis class, and I'll get the slide up to where we need to be here, which is chapter 30. I don't know how this thing backed up the way it did, but left us way behind here. So okay, so we ended last night with the birth of Leah having 4 sons and her struggle for love and attention from Jacob. So chapter 30, verses 1 through 8, Rachel is frustrated, not able to have children. And so she resorts to an old plan, the same plan that Sarah had resorted to in giving Jacob her maid. So let's see, Blake, you want to go ahead and start us off with verses 1 through
8. When Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, she envied her sister. She said to Jacob, "Give me children, or I shall die." Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel, and he said, "Am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb?" Then she said, "Here is my servant Bilhah. Go into her, so that she may give birth on my behalf, that even I may have children through her." So she gave her servant Bilhah as a wife, and Jacob went into her. And Bilhah had conceived and bore Jacob a son. Then Rachel said, "God has judged me, and has also heard my voice, and given me a son." Therefore she called his name Dan. Rachel's servant Bilhah conceived again, and bore Jacob a second son. Then Rachel said, "With my wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister, and have prevailed." So she called his name Naphtali.
Okay, great. So as we said, Rachel's extremely frustrated. We see that here in the first verse. "Give me children, or else I die." As if it's up to Jacob, right? It's pretty obvious that Jacob is able to produce children. So he responds in anger, "Am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb?" So we see some tension between the lovebirds here over this problem of fertility. And infertility can create a lot of tension in a marriage relationship. So I think Rachel's statement is really ironic when she says, "Give me children or else I die." I see you shaking your head there, Chris. Why is that? She dies in childbirth, giving birth to her second son, right? So yeah. So she resorts to the same plan, as we said, that Sarah resorts to, and gives Jacob her maid Bilhah. What's different here about the birth of these sons and the birth of Ishmael?
These guys are still in the tribes. Like they're still considered like in the line.
Yeah, they're going to be part of that promised nation, aren't they?
Not kicked out.
Yeah, so they're not kicked out. That's a big difference. Yeah. Anything else?
Rachel takes ownership.
Yeah, Rachel takes ownership of them, whereas before we noticed that Sarah didn't, even though that was her original plan. That never seemed to happen. Now, they will be called the concubines' children later on, but nonetheless, Rachel sees this as a great victory for herself and sees them as her adopted children. One of the things she says in verse 8 is, "With great wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister, and indeed I have prevailed." So we see the sister rivalry going on here. Actually, the word that's used here is Elohim in wrestlings. So some translations will say, "With the wrestlings of God, I have wrestled with my sister and prevailed." And again, both names are plays on things that are being said here. So the first son is named Dan because she says, "God has judged my case." And Dan, the word Dan in Hebrew means either like judge or vindicate or something along those lines. And then Naphtali, again, this idea of wrestling is embedded in his name. So I want to pause here and point out that what we see here in Rachel is she is very similar to Jacob in a number of ways in the narrative. So we notice that Rebecca was sort of similar to Abraham. And now we're going to notice that Rachel has a lot of similar qualities to Jacob. Might be a good thing to know for the final. So first of all, she's a younger sibling, right? Just like Jacob was. We're told that she's a shepherdess. You might recall the contrast between Esau and Jacob, how he was a hunter and Jacob was a man who dealt with flocks. There's a few obvious ones in this particular story that we've read. First of all, the sibling rivalry and the younger trying to get the better of the elder. And then this expression, wrestling with God, with wrestlings of God, I have wrestled with my sister. And of course, a few chapters from now, we're going to see Jacob wrestling with a mysterious stranger who's going to turn out to be God, because Jacob says, I've seen God face to face, and yet I've lived. Now, there's one we haven't come to yet in this story, but since we're doing all of these similarities, I want to put it up here. We'll notice that Laban will be deceived with regard to Rachel by feeling, just as Jacob deceived Isaac. So you remember when Jacob donned the goat hair and Isaac asked for him to come near so he could touch him. And he said, the hands are the hands of Esau, but the voice is the voice of Jacob. Well, when we get to chapter 31, we'll notice this same word being used as Laban is feeling around the tent of Rachel, looking for an item that she has stolen, but she is able to deceive him, as we'll see. So again, one similarity may be coincidence, but when you start to have a list of them, it says that we should pay attention to it, I think. So anything else in verses 1 through 8? So that gives us 6 sons right now. Okay, so let's pick up with 9 through 13. Leah retaliates by giving Zilpah to Jacob.
When Leah saw that she had stopped bearing, she took Zilpah, her maid, and gave her to Jacob his wife. And Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a son. Then Leah said, a troop comes, so she called his name Gad. And Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a second son. Then Leah said, I am happy, for the daughters will call me blessed, so she called his name Asher.
Okay, so here the competition revs up some more. When Leah sees she can't have any more children, she gives Jacob her maid, and ends up having identically 2 sons, same as Rachel. Meanwhile, Jacob's just sitting back and having women thrown at him, apparently. We're going to see that throughout the whole story here, he's very passive and lets the wives kind of call the shots and control what's going on. So the first son is called Gad. And there's different ways that you can translate what Leah says here. A troop comes, which is what the New King James says. The word Gad can refer to troop, but it can also refer to the idea of fortune. And other English translations take it that way. Do you have it that way, Chris, in yours? What does yours say?
So she said how fortunate I am.
Yeah, how fortunate I am. So that tells you right there that translators aren't 100% sure the best way to translate the name Gad, because it can have both meanings. And then Zilpah also gives birth to Asher, and we know what Asher means because it comes from the Hebrew word to bless. And that's what she says, the daughters will call me blessed. Now, this isn't our usual word that we see in Genesis for bless, which is barakah or barak, but it is a synonym, another word. You see it frequently in the Psalms where it says, happy is the one who. That's this word here, okay? All right, so now we've got 8 sons and counting. Any thoughts on these verses with Leah?
Do you think he would have known the story of Abraham?
Oh, I think definitely. Sure.
What do you think he was thinking? Because that didn't turn out so well.
No, it didn't. And obviously it's already not turning out well because you have the rivalry with the sisters, don't you? And Jacob was sort of deceived into marrying 2 women. And then he could have put a stop to the whole thing and said, no, I'm not going to take the maids. But, as I said, he's very passive here, and he's actually controlled by his wives and allows this competition to continue. So I want to highlight here the sisters' struggle before we move on to the next segment of the story. If we look at an outline of the birth stories of the kids that are being recounted, and we're in the middle of it right now, it starts off with Leah giving birth to 4 sons. And then this is followed by a competition by the sisters as they give their maids to Jacob. And then in the next verses that we're about to read, we'll see the sisters striking a bargain. And again, these stories are similar because we can see the competition that's brewing between the sisters. And then finally, Rachel's going to be able to give birth. So we have a little chiasm here, an ABBA type of pattern going on. So we're about to embark on verses 14 through 21. The sisters strike a bargain. But before we do that, I've got one more thing I want to throw up here for you guys. And that is, for the 4th time in the story of Jacob, an exchange takes place. Remember, we said how the word wages is a big word in the story. And this idea of exchanging one thing for another is included in that. So we have the stew being exchanged for the birthright, back in chapter 25. We have Jacob switching places with Esau and stealing the blessing. Laban exchanges Leah for Rachel. So we've covered all of those stories. And then this one that we're about to cover. Rachel exchanges Jacob for the mandrakes. Give me some of the mandrakes, she says to her sister, and I'll let Jacob sleep with you tonight. Any thoughts on anything on this particular slide, either about the outline of the birth stories, maybe what we can learn from that, or anything about these exchanges that are taking place? One of the great things about, this last point here of the exchanges is you can see that clearly there's a theme going through here. And that theme involves deception. It involves trying to outdo the other person and get a better bargain or a better deal, at least as far as they're concerned. And so there's a lot of fleshly dealings going on here, and not a lot of seeking the Lord for spiritual resolutions to some of the problems that develop. Okay, well, let's move on to verses 14 through 21. I'll leave this slide up for just a moment. I see some of you guys are still writing. Is your turn, Corinna, or oh, sorry, Skylar. Yeah.
Now Reuben went in the days of the harvest and found mandrakes in the field and brought them to his mother Leah. And Rachel said to Leah, "Please give me some of your son's mandrakes." But she said to her, "Is it a small matter that you have taken away my husband? Would you take away my son's mandrakes also?" But Rachel said, "Therefore we will lie with you tonight for your son's mandrakes." When Jacob came out of the field in the evening, Leah went out to meet him and said, "You must come in to me, for I have surely hired you with my son's mandrakes." And he lay with her that night. And God listened to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a fifth son. Leah said, "God has given me my wages because I have given my name to my husband." So she called his name Issachar. But then Leah conceived again and bore Jacob a sixth son. And Leah said, "God has with me with a good endowment from the Lord. Now my husband will dwell with me because I have borne him six sons." So she called his name Zebulun. Afterwards she bore a daughter and called her name.
Okay, great. Thank you. Does anyone here know what a mandrake is? I had to look this one up a number of years ago, when I was studying the passage and thinking, what in the world is a mandrake? You guys know? If not, you're going to learn something new tonight then.
I know Harry Potter.
Yeah.
Oh, is it used in Harry Potter? What does it mean there?
It's a plant.
Yeah.
That,
It sounds like it's the same kind of plant that we're talking
it's
about.
like a root plant.
Yes.
And then it screams if you pick it up.
Oh, it screams if you pick it up.
And
Okay.
it will kill you.
All right.
I have a feeling that's not the case.
No, it doesn't scream here. The Hebrew word is dudaim, which literally means love fruits. And mandrakes were considered an aphrodisiac, something to arouse a person, okay? And so this is what the battle's about. Reuben comes in with this plant to give mom in hopes that it will attract Jacob to her and she'll get pregnant. Rachel sees it and she's like, "Oh, I need those." Maybe that'll help me get pregnant. And so they strike this bargain. Of course, this is all superstition, right? There's no power in the plant to get someone pregnant. Now, there are apparently different substances that can arouse a person. So I don't have any personal experience with mandrakes. I don't know if they do that, but maybe that's a possibility. One of the things that I think we see here, which is very ironic, we could say we see Jacob's impotence. Since this is a battle over the women wanting their husband, he's, again, just very passive. They strike this bargain, the women do, and then as Jacob's coming in from the field, Leah says, "I bought you. You're mine tonight. You got to come home with me." And Jacob just follows, and lo and behold, Leah ends up becoming pregnant. So we could say he's traded a bit like a commodity, because Leah even uses the word hire, which is her father's word. This word for wage or hire, it's the same word. And remember last night I told you this was a very big word in the Laban story. So then the birth of Issachar is another wordplay on this key word in the story, this word for wages. I'd like to go around in life and your name is Wages. Mom, how did I get that name? Well, let me tell you a story. And then we read that Leah has yet another son, Zebulun. Again, wordplay on the meaning of Zebulun. God has endowed me with a good endowment. Really, the word Zebulun comes from the word Zabul, which means like honor or glory. So this idea of endowing, I guess, sort of fits with that. And then finally, she gives birth to a daughter, Dinah, which gives Leah the perfect number of children, 7. Why do you suppose we're told about the birth of Dinah? Because usually the focus is on the birth of sons here in Genesis. Yeah, it sort of gets us ready for the story that follows. This way we know who she is. And also then it gives Leah this perfect number of 7 children. So we're made aware of that here in the story. Well, for those of you then who've seen the Harry Potter movie, maybe you know what a mandrake looks like, but I've got some pictures here that this is what I had to Google years ago because I'm like, what do these things look like? I have no idea. I've never had one. So here's some pictures. I guess it makes a pretty little flower at the top, and then it's the root apparently that you eat, or I don't know what you do with it, make a tea out of it. I'm not sure, but it's the root that is used. And today, as you can see in the parenthesis, they're often nicknamed love apples. So they still carry this, whether it's a superstition or not, again, I don't know, but this idea that they will help someone to be attracted to you. Okay, so it's a strange story, isn't it? You've got 2 wives here, and they're making bargains over who gets to be with their husband. And apparently Jacob not only spent the night with her so that she could conceive one son, but he spent some other nights with her so that she ended up conceiving another son. And the other thing that this tells us is that apparently Jacob was spending all or almost all of his time with Rachel. Okay, so that's pretty sad again for Leah. Any other thoughts on these verses? Okay, so in 22 through 24, we finally get to some good news for Rachel about having a son.
Then God remembered Rachel. He listened to her and enabled her to conceive. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son and said, God has taken away my disgrace. She named him Joseph and said, may the Lord add to me another son.
Okay, we've got this expression, God remembered Rachel. Tell me some other people in Genesis that God remembered. Noah? And? Did I hear it back there? Oh, I thought maybe you said it.
The one that you did.
Yeah. Who? Not Lot, but Abraham. God remembered Abraham and he brought Lot out of Sodom. Yeah. So Lot was definitely involved. So we've learned then that this expression, God remembered, means what?
It's an expression of mercy.
Sorry, say again?
It's an expression of having mercy on this person.
Okay, an expression of having mercy, yeah. Dealing with whatever the problem or the situation is that needs dealt with. Okay, and it says God remembered Rachel and God listened to her. So what is that telling us?
She's been asking for a kid.
So apparently she's been praying, right? Seeking God. Jacob had said, am I in the place of God who's withheld from you the fruit of the womb? And maybe that had drove her to prayer, to seek God and to plead with God to open her womb. Because that's the next line that we have. God listened to her and opened her womb. Now, this causes me to think of something else, and that is sadly, we never read that Jacob prayed for his wives as Isaac did for Rebekah. Okay, it would have been nice if Jacob had shown more empathy toward Rachel's barrenness and had said, well, let's seek God about it. Let's pray about it. But if he did, it's certainly not recorded. And what we've seen of Jacob so far, to this point, he's not much of a man of prayer. So doesn't seem likely. So we're told in verse 23 that she conceived and bore a son. and said, God has taken away my reproach. She called his name Joseph and said, the Lord shall add to me another son. So we have two word plays here on the name Joseph. We have this word, God has taken away. It sounds kind of similar. Asaph is the Hebrew word, and Yosef is the word for Joseph. Okay. And then, may the Lord add to me another. The word add comes from the name Joseph, or Joseph comes from the word add. So there is a similar meaning there. But we have two word plays here. I guess Rachel figures she doesn't know if she's going to have any more, so she better get in as many puns on the name as she can. So that brings us to 11 sons and 1 daughter at this point. And, you know, it may well be that other daughters were born, because we're going to see later on when we get a list of the peoples going down into Egypt that this family grew into a pretty good sized family. Of course, that includes also grandkids and things like that. But again, the focus here is obviously on the male heirs. And so those are the ones who are focused on, except for Dinah, because of the important part she's going to play in the story later on. All right, you ready to move on? You are, okay. So in verses 25 through 43, Jacob outwits Laban. And so we'll read this, and then I'll talk to you about why I put this little map up here.
Soon after Rachel had given birth to Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, please release me so I can go home to my own country. Let me take my wives and children, for I have earned them by serving you, and let me be on my way. You certainly know how hard I have worked for you. Please listen to me, Laban replied. I have become wealthy, for the Lord has blessed me because of you. Tell me how much I owe you. Whatever it is, I'll pay it. Jacob replied, you know how hard I've worked for you, and how your flocks and herds have grown under my care. You had little indeed before I came, but your wealth has increased enormously. The Lord has blessed you through everything I've done, but now what about me? When can I start providing for my own family? What wages do you want? Laban asked again. Jacob replied, don't give me anything. Just do this one thing, and I'll continue to tend and watch over your flocks. Let me inspect your flocks today and remove all the sheep and goats that are speckled and spotted, along with all the black sheep. Give these to me as my wages. In the future, when you check on the animals you have given me as my wages, you'll see that I have been honest. If you find in my flocks any goats without speckles or spots, or any sheep that are not black, you will know that I have stolen them from you. All right, Laban replied, it will be as you say. But that very day, Laban went out and removed the male goats that were streaked and spotted, all the female goats that were speckled and spotted, or had white patches, and all the black sheep. He placed them in the care of his own sons, who took them a 3 days journey from where Jacob was. Meanwhile, Jacob stayed and cared for the rest of Laban's flocks. Then Jacob took some fresh branches from poplar, almond, and plane trees, and peeled off strips of bark, making white streaks on them. Then he placed these peeled branches in the watering troughs where the flocks came to drink, for that was where they mated. And when they mated in front of the white streaked branches, they gave birth to young that were streaked, speckled, and spotted. Jacob separated those lambs from Laban's flock, and at mating time he turned the flock to face Laban's animals that were streaked or black. This is how he built his own flock instead of increasing Laban's. Whenever the stronger females were ready to mate, Jacob would place the peeled branches in the watering troughs in front of them. Then they would mate in front of the branches. But he didn't do this with the weaker ones, so the weaker lambs belonged to Laban, and the stronger ones were Jacob's. As a result, Jacob became very wealthy, with large flocks of sheep and goats, female and male servants, and many camels and donkeys.
Okay, interesting story there. We'll have a chat about it. So the 14 years are up, and Jacob is ready to leave. But one of the problems is all he's got is his wife and kids. He owns nothing else. And Laban says something very interesting. He says in verse 27, now my translation says, I've learned by experience that the Lord has blessed me for your sake. Does anyone have anything else there?
Divination.
Yeah, some translations read divination. So does anyone know anything about divination in the ancient world, how it was practiced? Because we'll come across this again, actually, in the story of Joseph. There were different things that could be done. You could slay an animal and then have its liver examined. And if the liver looked a certain way, it meant certain things. You could get a cup with a liquid in it and drop oil in it, and then the various patterns made by the oil were supposed to tell you something. So, and I think there were probably other methods than those as well, but obviously this is sort of why in the law divination is condemned, because it's a belief that there's somehow power in doing this sort of thing to divine the future. But we don't know how Laban went about doing this, but what he does know is that the Lord has blessed him because of Jacob. That's a very significant statement. So I've got this map up here, and it's actually a map from later on in Israel's history. It was the best one I could find because I wanted you to see the various kingdoms that surround the nation of Israel. Because what I want to show you is that so far in Genesis, we have seen the following peoples blessed by Abraham and his descendants. Now, God had said, through your seed, all the families or nations of the earth will be blessed. We have Ishmael and the Arabian peoples that descended through Keturah. On the map there, on the far right, you can see the Nabattu tribes, and on the left, the Arabu tribes. These would be descendants of Ishmael and other Arabian peoples. And of course, this would include Saudi Arabia, which isn't on the map here. We have the Moabites and the Ammonites blessed because of their relationship to Abraham through Lot. And you can see the kingdoms of Ammon and Moab there on the right, orange and purple, right? And we have the Philistines. Remember Abimelech? You can see them there in the red down along the coast. We have the Edomites. Obviously, Esau is greatly blessed because he is a son of Isaac, a grandson of Abraham. And when we get to chapter 36, we're going to read his genealogy. So his kingdom's down at the bottom of the page there in the yellow. Laban represents the Syrians or the Arameans. And you can see the kingdom of Aram or the kingdom of Syria up in the far right-hand corner, kind of that bluish green color. And we have Laban confessing here that the Lord has blessed me because of you. So when you look at a map, what you notice is that all of the nations surrounding the nation of Israel are being blessed through Abraham and his descendants right here in Genesis. So even though we've said that obviously the ultimate fulfillment of this prophecy is Jesus, which happens in the New Testament, nonetheless, God doesn't just sit back for, God bless you, for several thousand years and say, well, I'm going to wait till I send my son to fulfill this blessing. He's already at work through Abraham and his descendants to bless the other nations. And of course, what's the purpose of this? Why does God want to use this family to bless the other nations? It's not a hard question.
It points to him. He chose them. So anything they do points to him, gives him glory.
Exactly. He wants to draw the nations to himself. That's why he chose Abraham. not because he hated everybody else and just wanted to pour out his love on Abraham and his descendants. He wants to use Abraham and his descendants to draw the rest of the world to himself. So we see a lot of mistakes, a lot of the flesh in Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but nonetheless, we see God's faithfulness in using them to bring blessing to the peoples round about them. And of course, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob do some good things as well. Now in verse 30, I think this is significant because for the first time, Jacob acknowledges God's blessing. He says in verse 30, "For what you had before I came was little, and it has increased to a great amount. The Lord has blessed you since my coming. And now when shall I also provide for my own house?" So Laban has said, "What can I do to keep you around?" And Jacob's saying, "Well, how about paying me? I got the wives and the kids for 14 years of labor, but I need some possessions." So they strike up a bargain here. So what's the bargain?
That he gets part of the flock.
Okay, and what part of the flock is he supposed to get?
The spotted ones. They keeps them here.
Okay, striped, speckled, and spotted, right? And how is he proposed that he gets started? Because he doesn't want to keep any of Laban's flock. But what does he request? Don't leave it all to Blake. Come on, guys. What does Jacob propose? If you don't have any sheep or goats, how are you going to get started with this?
It's basically kind of like giving Laban this front, like, oh, if you happen to have any sheep or goats that are like speckled or black, then I'll take those. But even though he's kind of like trying to manipulate it.
Yeah, actually, he's asking for those. He knows Laban has those because obviously he's been taking care of the flocks. And he's not asking to keep them. He's asking to use them so that he can get started growing his own spotted and speckled goats and sheep. But what does Laban do? Laban agrees to this, and then what does Laban do?
He gives the sheep to his sons and then sets like 3 days.
Yep. So he makes Jacob start with absolutely nothing. So Jacob has nothing but, the brown and the black goats and sheep. Nothing that is streaked, speckled, or spotted. So Jacob is literally starting from scratch. Now, what does the story tell us that Jacob does? This is quite curious.
A bunch of different trees and strips them of the bark and then puts it in water.
Yeah. So he takes like some branches and he peels them so that the branch itself is streaked, right? And puts them by the watering trough where the animals will mate, in the belief that what an animal looks at when they're mating is the kind of offspring that they'll produce. Okay, so this is an old superstition that obviously goes back a long, long way. And he's successful, which makes us go, now, wait a minute here. How can he use this superstition and be successful? Well, first of all, he's got God's blessing. God's on his side, right? We've seen God bless Abraham when he didn't do everything perfectly. But we're going to learn in chapter 31, Jacob's going to have a dream. And in that dream, God's going to say, I'm the one who gave you this increase. So we've seen Rachel and Leah with their superstition about the mandrakes, and God blesses. And here's Jacob with his superstition with the animals, and still God blesses. I actually read something in a commentary this week that gave some sort of potential that there's a scientific explanation behind this. He had something to do with saying that the animals would nibble on the bark or something, and that it put something in them that could cause them genetically to, yeah. So I don't know if that's true. I'm not an animal husbandry person, but he was suggesting that there may be some sort of biological explanation, as well as the fact that there's no doubt that God had his hand in it and did this. Now, there's also a clever wordplay going on here with Jacob peeling the bark. What Jacob does as he peels the bark is he exposes the white. And remember that Laban's name means white. Remember, we said that all the way back at the end of Genesis 11 when we looked at the genealogy, that Laban is the Hebrew word white that can stand for the moon. And we suggested that probably Laban, as well as his ancestors, were moon god worshippers. So as Jacob peels the bark, he's exposing the Laban. And he's using that then against Laban to increase his flocks. Now, one of the other things he does is he breeds he practices selective breeding, so that he breeds for himself the strongest animals, and he breeds weaker animals for Laban. So Jacob's been taken advantage of here for many years, but he is obviously very skilled when it comes to caring for sheep and goats. And so he kind of gets the best of Laban here between God's blessing and his own knowledge and experience. He manages to build himself a very strong flock, so that in verse 43 we read, "Thus the man became exceedingly prosperous and had large flocks, female and male servants, and camels and donkeys." So think of all the prosperity here that Jacob gains. And this is all now separate from what he would inherit eventually from Isaac. So he becomes a wealthy man on his own through God's blessing, let alone with all that he's going to inherit later on. Any questions or any closing thoughts here on chapter 30? Okay, well, we're just going to get into the beginning of chapter 31 before we take our first break. So let's go ahead and read verses 1 through 9.
Now Jacob heard the words of Laban's son saying, "Jacob has taken away all that it was our father's, and from what was our father's he has acquired all his wealth." And Jacob saw the countenance of Laban, and indeed it was not favorable toward him as before. Then the Lord said to Jacob, "Return to the land of your fathers and to your family, and I will be with you." So Jacob sent and called Rachel, Leah to the field to his flock, and said to them, "I see your father's countenance, that it is not favorable toward me as before, but the God of my father has been with me. And you know that with all my might I have served your father. Yet your father has deceived me and changed my wages 10 times, but God did not allow him to hurt me. If he said thus, the speckled shall be your wages, then all the flocks bore speckled. And if he said thus, the streaked shall be your wages, then all the flocks bore streaked. So God has taken away the livestock of your father and given them to me."
Okay, so we see a change taking place here. Things are not smooth anymore between Jacob and the family of Laban. What do you make of Laban's son's statement in verse 1? Jacob has taken away all that was our father's, and from what was our father's he has acquired all this wealth.
They're probably worried about their own inheritance.
Yeah, they sound like chips off the old block. They're concerned about their inheritance. And I would say that part of this statement is true, but part of it is also false. Jacob has taken away all that was our father's. Well, that's not true, because he didn't give him anything. Jacob had to start from scratch, as we saw in the last chapter. Now, it is true that what was our father, it was from what was our father's that he acquired all this wealth. Well, that's true because he had to start with the flocks that he was raising of Laban's, but Laban gave him no advantage or no help whatsoever. So there's envy here, and people aren't getting along well, and that includes Laban in verse 2. And then in verse 3, the Lord comes to Jacob and he says, return to the land of your fathers and to your family, and I will be with you. So he gets the green light here from the Lord. And sometimes the Lord uses these kinds of situations, doesn't he? We pray to him, we ask for him to use circumstances, to work through people, to work through his word, whatever, to communicate with us what his will is. And here he starts to make things difficult. Well, the Lord doesn't, but things start to become difficult between Jacob and the family of Laban. And then the Lord actually gives him a direct word that it's time to go. So both circumstances and this direct word let him know. And then he calls the wives out into the field, and what do they have to say? What they say is very interesting. Or actually, they don't say it here yet, do they? He does the talking. Sorry about that. It's in the next section where he asks them. But he says in verse 6, and you know that with all my might I have served your father. What do you make of verse 7? Yet your father has deceived me and changed my wages 10 times, but God did not allow him to hurt me. So what do we learn from this? And even the next verse, verse 8.
It's just cool to see like God's blessing being passed down from each family member. Like every time people like try to harm them, or even they're gonna hurt themselves, like with Abraham lying to everyone, like God still like prevents them from doing harm. And like same with Laban here, like instead of Laban just switching it up all the time, God like continues to go with the changes. Like he didn't stop blessing.
Right, God continues to be faithful and bless. He had promised Abraham, those who bless you, I will bless, and those who curse you, I will curse, right? And so we learned from these verses that apparently Laban didn't even stick to the original deal. Whenever he saw Jacob prospering, he would change the deal. And so we're told if he said the speckled will be your wages, then all the flocks bore speckled. Oh, okay, I better change this deal. Okay, so now the streaked will be your wages. And then they all bore streaked. And so Laban couldn't win because he was fighting against God's blessing here. And Jacob acknowledges the fact that God was taking care of him. So we're beginning to see some good things in Jacob as he acknowledges God's blessing and God's protection upon him. Okay, well, let's pause for our first break and see you guys shortly. Okay, so we pick up with verses 10 through 13, where Jacob relates a dream that God had given to him. I think we're back to you, Blake. 31, 10 through 13.
In the breeding season of the flock, I lifted up my eyes and saw in a dream that the goats that mated with the flock were striped, spotted, and molted. Then the angel of God said to me in the dream, Jacob. And I said, here I am. And he said, lift up your eyes and see. All the goats that mate with the flock are striped, spotted, and molted. For I have seen that all Laban is doing to you. I am the God of Bethel, and where you anointed a pillar and made a vow to me. Now arise, go out from this land, and return to the land of your kindred.
Okay, so Jacob has a dream. How many dreams has Jacob had so far in the narrative? What was the other one? The one at Bethel, right? The ladder, as we call it, Jacob's ladder. And so, as I mentioned, as we go through the end of Genesis here, we're going to see a number of dreams, ways in which God is communicating to people. Might be a good final exam question, something about name some people who have a couple of dreams or something along those lines. Anyway, what does Jacob's dream consist of?
lot of goods.
It's dreaming about work. Anyone ever dreamed about work? Happens, doesn't it? Yeah, but specifically, what is going on in the dream? Talk to me back there, Skylar. What's going on in this dream?
He's telling him to go back to the
Yeah, and he tells him in the dream too, doesn't he, that this blessing of Jacob having the streaked and spotted animals is because God has been with him and God has seen what Laban is doing to him. So this is further confirmation that it wasn't simply through Jacob's ingenuity or superstition that this had happened, but that God had did it. And then, as you said, Skylar, he is being told to return to his land. And he says in verse 13, I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed the pillar and where you made a vow to me. So that directly recalls that story. Where did that story happen? What chapter was that? Just last night. 28. Good, Luke, chapter 28. You know, it's never too soon to start learning things from each of the last 25 chapters because the final exam comes next week, right? So yeah, so chapter 28, Jacob's dream, Jacob's ladder, okay? So that's a good one to remember already. So God has appeared to him, spoken to him in this dream, and confirmed to him that he should return. So he's called Rachel and Leah out to the field to talk with them. Notice he calls them out to the field. He doesn't want to do it somewhere where other ears can overhear. So he brings them out to the field. And obviously he's telling them what God has done, but then he's looking for their agreement in this. And that's what we get in the next few verses. So Luke, if you want to read verses 14 through 16.
Then Rachel and Leah answered and said to them, is there still any portion or inheritance for us in our father's house? Are we not considered strangers by him? For he has sold us and also completely consumed our money. For all these riches which God has taken from our father are really ours and our children. Now then, whatever God has said to you, do it.
Okay. Anything strike you about these verses?
Their father handled their dowry.
Yeah, their father has spent all their dowry money, right? Treated them like commodities. So here's that whole idea again of wages and hire and commodity. Okay, so they not only see what's happened to Jacob, but they've experienced themselves their father's greed and how he has used them for his own gain. Really sad. What else?
They're actually agreeing with one another.
That's what I'm looking for. These sisters who seem to have been at each other's throats are actually agreeing. So again, this is another way that God confirms things, doesn't he? Through people that we love, through family, friends. When there is a solid agreement about something, we have a greater confidence that God is leading us in a certain direction. So Jacob, he has the problems going on with Laban and Laban's sons. He has a direct word from God in the dream, and he has the agreement of his wives. So there's three solid things happening that indicate to Jacob it's time to leave. Okay, so verses 17 through 21. Rather than saying his goodbyes, however, what we learn here is that Jacob feels that he has to flee from Laban. So, Skylar.
And Jacob rose and set his sons and his wives on camels, and he cleared away all his livestock and all his possessions which he obtained, and acquired livestock which he obtained again of them. Go to his father Isaac in the land of Canaan. Now Laban had gone to shear his sheep, and Rachel had stolen the household idols that were her father's, and Jacob stole away, unknown to Laban the Syrian, and that he did not tell him that seeing him. So he fled with all that he had. He rose and crossed the river and headed toward the mountains.
All right, so verse 17, Jacob rose and set his sons and wives on camels. No goodbyes to Laban. Why do you suppose that he didn't want to tell Laban that they were leaving? Laban might make it difficult. Maybe try to strike another bargain, or maybe forcefully try to keep Jacob there by not allowing the wives and children to leave, which is what Jacob's going to say later on, that he was afraid that that's what Laban would do. So what gives Jacob the advantage here? There's a couple of things going on that gives Jacob a big head start. Remember, even back in the last chapter, what was their agreement? What did Laban do? Wasn't really their agreement, but it's what Laban did. Yeah, he separated them 3 days, right, from Jacob. So he was doing that to make sure Jacob couldn't cheat, but this ends up being a great advantage for Jacob. Then that's a 3-day head start right there. But then something else happens in the narrative here that also makes it a good time for Jacob to flee.
He's sharing his sheep.
Yeah, Laban is sharing the sheep, and this is a big event in the ancient world. There would be partying and feasting, along with a lot of hard work, and it would take, depending on the size of the flock, but usually about a week or so to accomplish this task. So this gives Jacob an even greater advantage, because once Laban hears, and it's going to take him 3 days to hear, he can't necessarily just up and leave right that moment. If he's in the middle of shearing the sheep, that's got to be completed before then he can leave. So Jacob thinks this will give him enough time to get back to the land of Canaan. 2 things we're told here. Number one, in verse 19, that Rachel stole the household idols that were her father's. Wow, that kind of perks up the ears. What's going on here? Any ideas?
I thought they were gonna protect her and her family because they're going in such a secret way.
Okay, yeah, she may trust in these household gods, thinking that they will protect her and her family. After all, her father and her grandfather before him and her great-grandfather had all worshipped other gods. So that's a real possibility. Another possibility is that sometimes these gods were like coated in gold or silver, and because they've just complained about how their father spent their inheritance, maybe Rachel thinks it's only right that she take these and maybe get the gold or silver from them later on. So we don't know at this point for sure whether Rachel is also worshiping these gods and looking for protection, or whether she's stealing them in hopes of getting some kind of financial gain from them. But this is going to cause a big problem here later in the story. And then in verse 20, we're also told, and Jacob stole away. So Rachel stole the household idols, and Jacob stole away. So we get that word stole twice here in these verses, which lets us know, obviously, Laban is going to be furious once he finds out that they're gone and that his household idols are missing. Now, some people have said that these household idols, they're called teraphim. I don't know if any of your translations use that word, teraphim. But some have said that they believe that these idols were a symbol of the family inheritance, and that the one who possessed the idols possessed the inheritance. And sometimes you'll read that in Genesis commentaries, but I've been persuaded that that's not the most likely answer why Rachel would take them, because she's not going to get her father's inheritance, right? So having these idols would not give her any rights anyway. So I think it's more likely one of the other two answers that we discussed. So in verses 22 through 30, Laban hears about it and he pursues.
On the third day, Laban was told that Jacob had fled. Taking his relatives with him, he pursued Jacob for 7 days and caught up with him in the hill country of Gilead. Then God came to Laban the Aramean in a dream at night and said to him, "Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad." Jacob had pitched his tent in the hill country of Gilead from Laban over time, and Laban and his relatives camped there too. Then Laban said to Jacob, "What have you done? You deceived me, and you've carried off my daughters like captives in war. Why did you run off secretly and deceive me? Why didn't you tell me so I could send you away with joy and singing to the music of timbrels and harps? You didn't even let me kiss my grandchildren and my daughters goodbye. You've done a foolish thing, and I have the power to harm you. But last night the God of your father said to me, 'Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad.' Now you have gone off because you long to return to your father's house. But why did you steal my gods?"
Okay. Now, in the previous verses, we had been told that Jacob crossed the river and headed toward the mountains of Gilead. What river is being referenced here?
The Euphrates.
The Euphrates River. Okay, and I believe I have a map here on a later slide, so we'll be able to see exactly the path that Jacob was taking here. Hopefully I do. And so the land of Gilead is actually the land on the other side of the Jordan River. Okay, so opposite the land of Canaan. And this is where Jacob is when Laban catches up with him. How long does it take Laban to catch up with him?
7 days.
7 days. And why is he able to catch up with Jacob? How is he able to overcome the advantage that Jacob had?
Jacob's talking about children.
Children, flocks, right? Whereas Laban's just coming with his men. So he's unencumbered and can travel much, much faster. We see God's protection in verse 24. God comes to Laban in a dream. So more dreams. Be careful that you do not speak to Jacob, neither good nor bad. What do you suppose that means? Don't speak to Jacob, neither good nor bad. Because Laban has some pretty strong words for Jacob when he catches up with him.
Does it mean like don't bless or curse him?
Okay, yeah, probably don't do any harm to him. Be very careful about what you do with Jacob, okay? Good nor bad here probably is a way of you know how you use opposites to mean the whole of something. For instance, we talk about the heaven and the earth, we mean like the universe. It's called a merism for any of you English students. And so good or bad, you know, that's both ends of the spectrum. In other words, don't do anything that could bring harm to Jacob. So we see God being faithful again and protecting Jacob. So when Laban finally arrives, what does he say to Jacob? You got to love his speech here. Gives us some more insight, I think, into the kind of person that he is.
I love that he asked, "Why did you steal my gods?"
Yeah.
I'm thinking, your God just talked to me. Why do you need another one?
Kind of shows the difference between Jacob's God and Laban's gods, right?
Why do you
Yeah.
not-
If gods can be stolen, they're not too powerful. But a God who appears to you in a dream and warns you, there's some power. Okay, that's good. What else?
as if like he would have given them like some goodbye music and he wanted, you know, to say bye to all his family. But,
Yeah, I think knowing Laban, we know how disingenuous this is. Oh, I would have sent you off, you know, with joy and songs. And, you know, I don't think so. Don't think that probably would have happened. He also says in verse 26, when he first starts accusing him, you've stolen away from me unknown. Well, that's true. Carried away my daughters like captives taken with the sword. Now, what do you think of that statement? Did Jacob take Laban's daughters unwillingly? No, we have the story just a few verses earlier letting us know they were in 100% agreement. They wanted to leave. Okay, so he's misrepresenting the facts in every way. Misrepresenting the fact that Jacob forced them to go, misrepresenting himself, saying, oh, he would have sent them away with joy and song. So again, we just see the kind of deceitful and disingenuous person that Laban is. Now, he's kind of dumb too. In verse 29, he tells Jacob about the dream that he had. But I guess he feels that this is one way that he can get a threat across without actually doing anything. It's in my power to do you harm. But the God of your father spoke to me last night saying, be careful that you speak to Jacob neither good nor bad. So I guess he just wanted to show a little muscle in his arm and say, well, I could have hurt you, but Jacob will use this later against Laban. Okay, and then he takes Jacob totally by surprise with the last accusation. Why did you steal my gods? He saves that for the very end. So that leads us into the next part of the adventure here. We get Jacob's response in verses 31 to 42.
I rushed away because I was afraid, Jacob answered. I thought you would take your daughters from me by force. But as for your gods, see if you can find them, and let the person who has taken them die. And if you find anything else that belongs to you, identify it before all these relatives of yours, and I will give it back. For Jacob did not know that Rachel had stolen the household idols. Laban went first into Jacob's tent to search there, then into Leah's, and then the tents of the 2 servant wives. But he found nothing. Finally, he went into Rachel's tent, but Rachel had taken the household idols and hidden them in her camel saddle, and now she was sitting on them. When Laban had thoroughly searched her tent without finding them, she said to her father, please, sir, forgive me if I don't give up for you. I'm having my monthly period. So Laban continued his search, but he could not find the household idols. Then Jacob became very angry and he challenged Laban. What's my crime? He demanded. What have I done wrong to make you chase after me as though I were a criminal? You have rummaged through everything I own. Now show me what you found that belongs to you. Set it out here in front of us, before our relatives, for all to see. Let them judge between us. For 20 years I have been with you, caring for your flocks. In all that time, your sheep and goats never miscarried. In all those years, I never used a single ram of yours for food. If any were attacked and killed by wild animals, I never showed you the carcass and asked you to reduce the count of your flock. No, I took the loss myself. You made me pay for every stolen animal, whether it was taken in broad daylight or in the dark of night. I worked for you throughout the scorching heat of the day and through cold and sleepless nights. Yes, for 20 years I slaved in your house. I worked for 14 years, earning your 2 daughters, and then 6 more years for your flock. And you changed my wages 10 times. In fact, if the God of my father had not been on my side, the God of Abraham and the fearsome God of Isaac, you would have sent me away empty-handed. But God has seen your abuse and my hard work. That is why he appeared to you last night and rebuked you.
Okay, great. 20 years of frustration pouring out of Jacob's mouth there, I think. So at first, notice Jacob is a little on the defensive. He doesn't really start getting angry until after Laban does the search and can't find anything. But he answers honestly in verse 31, why did you steal away? And he says, because I was afraid, for I said, perhaps you would take your daughters from me by force. And I think Jacob knows well that Laban would have tried to do that. So not knowing that Rachel has stolen the idols, he gives Laban free rein. Search through the camp, see if you can find these items that you claim that I've stolen. So I love how the story is told. It's a good suspense story because it starts with Jacob's tent, goes to Leah's, and we're not worried. We know Jacob doesn't have it. We know Leah doesn't have it. Goes to the maids. Oh, we know the maids don't have it. Now he's coming to Rachel's tent. What's going to happen? And she has a clever little ruse up her sleeve. What does she do? Luke.
Basically just sits on them and says she can't get up.
Yeah. So,
So clever.
how does she just sit? Does she just take them and sit on them, or what's the story say? Yeah. So she puts them in a camel's saddlebag, right, and then sits on them. I think we'll see that's important in just a moment. So I wanted to catch that. And then why can't she get up? Oh, she's on her period. So we can see that Rachel's learned a little bit of deviousness from her father. And she is a lot like her husband, who can be very devious and deceptive too. Now, one of the things that I want to point out to you in verse 34, and again, I'm reading the New King James, so I don't know what your translation says, but now Rachel had taken the household idols, put them in the camel's saddle, and sat on them. And Laban searched all about the tent. It's that word searched, or whatever your translation says, that I want to draw your attention to. This is the word where he felt about, the same word used of Isaac feeling the hands of Jacob. Okay, so we said this was a similarity between Rachel and Jacob, how they both deceived their fathers through touch. Okay. Now, I want to chat a little bit about this story because I think that this is a humorous look at idolatry by Moses, and that every Israelite would have, who believed in the one true God, would probably got a good chuckle out of this story. First of all, these gods are so powerless that they can be stolen, right? We've talked about that already. And then Rachel sits on the gods as she menstruates. So there's nothing more insulting than this. This is a very unclean situation these gods have gotten themselves into. The gods must be carried and hidden. Okay, so we've mentioned that one. They have no power to extricate themselves from this unclean and shameful situation. No true God would allow this kind of shame and uncleanness to happen to them if they could do anything about it. And clearly they couldn't do anything about it. And then the reason I wanted to emphasize that it was a camel's saddlebag is because even the camel is considered an unclean animal. So you have a woman on her period with the idols inside a camel bag. So uncleanness on top of uncleanness. And the gods have no power to do anything about it. So everyone will get a good chuckle out of this story if they're a believing Israelite. Any questions or any observations? Anything I overlooked you want to talk about?
It does seem like Jacob is venting big time.
Yeah.
He's just spilling it all out.
Yeah. And as he vents, we see further Laban's mistreatment of him. You know, he's out in the heat of the day and the cold of the night, if something gets stolen, Laban doesn't take the loss. It's all Jacob's fault, and Jacob has to bear the loss. If something gets torn by a beast, Jacob just bore the loss. So, yeah, he's venting for sure. And in verse 42, again, he recognizes the hand of God on him. Unless the God of my father, the God of Abraham and the fear of Isaac had been with me, surely now you would have sent me away empty-handed. That's very important because remember at Bethel, God had said, I will be with you. And then when he comes to Jacob and tells him to return to the land, he says, I will be with you. So Jacob is acknowledging here God's faithfulness in protecting him. Okay, so this is a long chapter, the last section here, verses 43 to 55.
And Laban answered and said to Jacob, these daughters are my daughters, and these children are my children, and this flock is my flock. All that you see is mine. But what can I do this day to these my daughters, or to their children whom they have borne? Now therefore, come, let us make a covenant, you and I, and let it be a witness between you and me. So Jacob took a stone and set it up as a pillar. Then Jacob said to his brethren, gather stones. And they took stones and made a heap, and they ate there on the heap. Laban called it Jegar-Shahadutha, but Jacob called it Galeed. And Laban said, this heap is a witness between you and me this day. Therefore, its name was called Galeed, also Mitzpah, because he said, may the Lord watch between you and me when we are absent from one another. If you afflict my daughters, or if you take other wives besides my daughters, although no man is with us, see, God is witness between you and me. Then Laban said to Jacob, here is this heap, and here is this pillar which I have placed between you and me. This heap is a witness, and this pillar is a witness, that I will not pass beyond this heap to you, and you will not pass beyond this pillar to me for harm. The God of Abraham, the God of Nahor, the God of their father, judge between us. And Jacob swore by the fear of his father Isaac. Then Jacob offered a sacrifice on the mountain and called his brethren to eat bread. And they ate bread and stayed all night on the mountain. And early in the morning, Laban arose and kissed his sons and daughters and blessed them. Then Laban departed and returned to his place.
Okay, so they can't agree, but they do make a covenant to not harm one another, basically. It's kind of a negative covenant. Notice that Laban refuses to accept any blame in verse 43. The daughters are mine, the children are mine, the flocks are mine. He doesn't even acknowledge that Jacob deserved a wage for all of those years that he worked for him. So he said, but what can I do about it? Let's make a covenant. So we have stones again in the Jacob story. Verse 45, he takes a stone, sets it up as a pillar, and he's going to tell us later what the meaning of that is. And then he has his kinsmen gather stones and make a heap. And it's by these stones then that they are going to make this covenant. So in 47, we get the name that Laban calls it, which is an Aramaic expression. And then Jacob calls it Galeed, which is very similar to the name Gilead. Okay, so we get the idea here. This is where Gilead comes from this covenant that Jacob makes here. Let's see. Laban lays some obligations on Jacob to take care of his daughters and not to let any harm come to them. And Jacob says the reason the pillar is here is it's a boundary between you and me, so that I won't pass over to you and you won't come to harm me. And then in 53, again, he refers both to the God of Abraham and this very interesting expression, the fear of his father Isaac. It's the second time he's used it. And it's the only other place in the Bible that this expression is used. We probably have an idea what it means, but let's just chat about it for a moment, make sure we're all on the same page. What do you think that Jacob means by this expression, the fear of Isaac? Or maybe it's good that we ask the question.
I was going to ask this question.
Okay.
So,
Good. So don't expect Blake to answer. It's up to one of you guys.
It's right to take God to seek to be obedient to him. So sort of saying, because Isaac sought to obey God's will.
Yeah. Okay. So it's right to fear God. So we have the idea that someone who fears God is obedient to him, keeps his commands, and it carries the idea of reverence and all, right? I think your translation, Chris, used something along those lines.
Yeah, mine says the fearsome God of his father Isaac.
Okay, the fearsome God. Okay. Yeah, and then he also, notice he includes the gods of Nahor and the gods of their father. Now, I say gods plural because they worshipped more than one god. So in that particular case, even though the New King James capitalizes it as the God of Nahor, it's probably literally the gods of Nahor and the gods of their fathers, since they worshipped more than one God. So they eat a meal together. Jacob offers a sacrifice. They eat a meal together. And Laban leaves peacefully in verse 55, kissing and blessing his daughters and grandchildren, or at least the grandchildren. Doesn't say it does say he kissed the daughters. I was wondering whether he's leaving them out or not. Okay, that's a quick summary of what's going on there. Any other questions besides this one about the fear of Isaac? Notice we have another covenant, and with a covenant always comes a meal as a way of sealing the covenant. Another pillar. Yeah, so once again, we have stones in the story of Jacob. We have the heap of stones and we have the pillar. All right, well, we've come to the end of this particular slide, so I need to pull up a new set of slides here. So we'll get started here on chapter 32. And just for some introductory ideas here, first of all, notice that these next several chapters are going to focus on both Jacob and Esau. Jacob has finally parted from Laban, and he survived that confrontation, but he has another, perhaps more fearful one that he has to deal with, and that is meeting his brother Esau and not knowing how Esau is going to treat him. So there's a parallel structure here in the next two chapters. And these next two chapters deal with Jacob getting ready to meet Esau. So the first couple of verses of chapter 32, we're going to read this interesting encounter of the angels of God meeting Jacob at a place that he names Mahanaim. And then verses 3 through 21 will begin to talk about Jacob's preparations to meet his brother Esau. He sends message, he gets word back that Esau's coming with 400 men, so he doesn't know quite what that means. And then at the end of chapter 32, we have another story where the angel of God meets Jacob at a place that Jacob names Peniel, which means face of God. So this is that wrestling match that takes place. And we don't know at first who this person is, but later on we see that Jacob identifies him as God. And I think he's identified later on in Scripture as the angel of God, in fact. So. And then finally, in chapter 33, Jacob meets Esau. So we don't have an A, B, B, A pattern. Rather, they're parallel. A, B, A, B. Angels, Esau, angel, Esau. Okay? So that's the way these next two chapters lay out for us. All right, I'll leave this up just for a few seconds, but let's go ahead and read verses 1 and 2 of chapter 32.
Jacob went on his way, and the angels of God met him. And when Jacob saw them, he said, "This is God's camp." So he called the name of that place Mahanaim.
Okay, Mahanaim.
Yeah.
So this is an interesting little story. Again, something that kind of takes us by surprise. Jacob goes on his way and the angels of God met him. Okay, doesn't happen every day. And what does it mean? What do you think?
It's just really funny. He's just like, oh, look, angels. I guess I'm gonna camp here.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know, just like seeing God going.
Okay. Yeah, it sounds like a positive encounter, doesn't it? Kind of a way of God reassuring Jacob. He calls it God's camp, doesn't he? We'll talk more about that in a moment. But just as Jacob met angels on his departure from Canaan in the dream, angels ascending and descending on the staircase, so he meets them on his return. Kind of like a greeting party, maybe. Welcome back to Canaan, Jacob. Now,
maybe a reminder of what the angels told him last time he left. We'll bring you back. Trust me.
I like that. Yeah, that could very well be the case. There are two ways to view this encounter, and I just want to make you aware of the two different viewpoints in case you're reading a Genesis commentary on this passage in the future. One, that as we've been saying, that this is a reassurance of God's protection. And to be honest, I do think that's the correct way to look at it. But some people also suggest that it might be a hostile encounter. And they suggest that for two reasons. Number one, at the end of the chapter, Jacob's going to have this wrestling match with, the Lord or the angel of the Lord. And so they suggest this may be a prelude in that way. And also the word that says the angels met him, the angels of God met him. The Hebrew word pagah sometimes is used in the context of a threat, okay? But not always, not always. So you'll read some commentators who think that this is actually a hostile encounter that Jacob faces here. But I believe if we look at the context, it is more about reassurance because he's just left Laban and he survived that hostile encounter with Laban. And it's as if the angels are a way of reassuring him of God's protection. It echoes the dream from chapter 28, where the angels were ascending and descending on the staircase. That was certainly positive. So in my opinion, this is probably a positive encounter. But it's another one of those passages in Genesis that gets interpreted different ways. At least we only have two rather than three interpretations on this one. Now, the word camp in Hebrew is mahaneh, and the doubling of that is Mahanaim, which means two camps. So that's why this place gets called Mahanaim. Jacob says this is God's camp. So in this story, the number 2 keeps popping up to us. We could ask why that is. So Mahanaim means two camps. What are the two camps?
Is it Jacob's camp and the angels?
Okay, it looks like it's probably Jacob's camp and God's camp, right? Or the angels' camp. So there's a camp of angels and then there's Jacob's camp. However, in the next few verses, as we read, we're going to learn that Jacob divides his family into two camps. So this seems to be, this word Mahanaim seems to take on different definitions as we move through the story. So later, it's going to refer to the two camps of Jacob. But then there's two brothers. Jacob is going to meet up with his brother Esau. So there's the camp of Jacob and the camp of Esau. And there's two meetings here between God and between Esau. The first meeting with Esau is when Jacob sends the messengers, and the second is when he encounters them. We've already read the first meeting here with God, and we'll read about the second in a moment. So, in other words, there are a lot of different ways that the story seems to use this word Mahanaim to mean two camps. Now, someone has suggested, the number two might emphasize the idea of division. Maybe it's speaking of division in Jacob's family. Maybe it's speaking of division between him and God. I think that would be more for those who see the encounter as hostile here in verses 1 and 2. Although it's clear later that there's still a gulf between him and God because he's wrestling with him at the end of the chapter. I would also suggest that there's another meaning behind it, perhaps a more positive meaning. This number 2 continues to focus on Jacob's two encounters, one with God and one with Esau. And we're going to see by the end of chapter 33 that Jacob has reconciled himself with God and with Esau. So it may stand for something like the two parties that Jacob needs to be reconciled to. And by the end of the story, he in fact is. So again, this is one of those things some scholars can interpret negatively or positively, depending on how you look at the overall story here. Any thoughts or questions on verses 1 and 2? Okay, let's read the next section here. Verses 3 through 8, Jacob prepares to meet Esau.
Then Jacob sent messengers before him to Esau his brother in the land of Seir, the country of Edom. And he commanded them, saying, Speak thus to my lord Esau. Thus your servant Jacob says, I have dwelt with Laban and stayed there until now. I have oxen and donkeys, flocks, and male and female servants, and I have sent to tell my lord that I may find favor in his sight. And the messengers returned to Jacob, saying, We came to your brother Esau, and he also is coming to meet you, and 400 men are with him. So Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed, and he divided the people that were with him and the flocks and herds and camels into two companies. And he said, If Esau comes to the one company and attacks it, then the other company which is left will escape.
All right. So Jacob sent messengers before him to Esau, so he wants to let his brother know he's returning in hopes that there'll be this reconciliation. There's a little wordplay going on here because Jacob just met the angels of God, and the word angel means what? We talked about this one time, not that I expect you to remember that. I just thought it was something you guys might know. It means messenger, yeah. So both the Hebrew and the Greek of angel it's the word messenger. So Jacob has just encountered the messengers of God, and now he is sending messengers off to Esau. That connection is not insignificant. We're going to see that Esau and God are drawn closely together in this story in chapter 32 and 33. And we'll talk about the significance of that once we get further into the story. Okay, so he sends messengers and they return, and what do they have to tell Jacob? Okay, that doesn't sound so good, does it? I mean, Jacob has no idea why is he bringing 400, and he thinks the worst, of course, as we all might. No word that, oh, your brother Esau said he's really glad you're back and he's looking forward to seeing you. No, he's just coming with 400 men. This is all you can tell me? Who knows whether Esau maybe at first just wanted to leave Jacob in a little doubt as a way to get revenge, or whether God changes his heart on the way. Who knows? But it looks ominous at this point. Now, every time that Jacob speaks to Esau or has his messengers speak to Esau, constantly throughout the story, he refers to Esau as my Lord and to himself as your servant. Now, what kind of language is that?
Respectful.
Very respectful. Kind of language who would use to who?
Servant to the master.
A servant to a master, a servant to a king, right? A servant to God. So, yeah, it's that sort of honorary language. So notice then that Jacob is very humble in the way he addresses his brother. And do you remember the prophecy when the two were clashing in Rebekah's womb and she got the prophecy? What was said?
The elder shall serve the younger.
The older will serve the younger. And then when Isaac blessed Jacob, thinking he was blessing Esau, he said, your brother will serve you. So this is very interesting because Jacob here is coming off as the servant and addressing Esau as the superior. Okay. Something that's going on in the Hebrew text that I want you guys to be aware of are, guess what? Word plays. Hard to believe there's word plays, but yes, there are. So the word camp, as we've said in Hebrew, is mahaneh. Jacob is going to prepare a present for Esau, and this is the word mincha. So mahaneh mincha. You can hear the similarities, similar letters, right? And he's going to seek grace in the eyes of Esau, which is the Hebrew word for chen. So we have mahaneh, mincha, and chen. And all three of these words share the H and the N in them, and then the other two also share the M vowel, or the M consonant in them as well. And as we move through the story, we'll see there's a lot of other word plays going on as well, but this helps to enrich the story. The word for present, mincha, is the word that we saw in the story of Cain and Abel, that when they made an offering to God. And it was used for both of their offerings. And we pointed that out to show that God didn't view their sacrifice differently just because one was vegetable and one was animal. The mincha was used for both. Okay, so just to help you recall that. All right, so what does Jacob do here once we hear that he's greatly afraid?
Splits up the group.
Splits them up, right? And what's the purpose for that?
That half can escape if we get
Okay, so Esau can't attack everybody. He'll have to go after one or the other, and the others can escape. So this is where we get the two camps or the two companies in Jacob's family. Okay, well, we'll pause there, let you guys have your next break, and we'll pick up here when you come back. So we're going to notice as we go through Jacob preparing to meet Esau that there's 4 responses by Jacob to Esau's approach. Good idea to know these. Just saying. So response 1 is preparation for war by dividing the camp. Which is what we just read in verses 7 and 8. Now, the next response is in the next group of verses that we're about to read. So let's go ahead and read verses 9 through 12. Whose turn? Skylar?
Then Jacob said, O God of my father Abraham, God of my father Isaac, the Lord who said to me, return to your country and to your family, and I will be along with you. I am not worthy of the least of all the mercies and all the truth which you have shown your servant. For I crossed over this Jordan with my staff, and now I have come to your company. Deliver me, I pray, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, lest he come back and attack me and the murder of the children. And he said, I will surely treat you well, and make your descendants as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered.
Okay. So Jacob's second response is to pray to God. This is a good response. So, response number one is a little strategy, but response number two is to call out to God in prayer. Interestingly enough, this is the longest prayer in Genesis. And perhaps even more important than that, it is Jacob's first prayer, unless we count Jacob's vow at the end of Genesis 28. Some people consider that a prayer, but he's not addressing God in the first person there as he is here. So this is a guy who's been a rather prayerless individual from what we can tell based on the information that we have in Genesis. So it's very significant here. This is starting to say, we're seeing a change in Jacob. First of all, we started seeing him acknowledging God as being the one who was blessing him, being the one who was protecting him. And now he's actually seeking God in prayer. So let's talk a little bit about the content of the prayer. What do you notice here about Jacob's prayer? Let's start, at the beginning, kind of work our way through it.
The continuation of the promise for Abraham.
Yeah, so he calls on the God of Abraham and Isaac, and he reminds the Lord of his promise. Lord, you're the one who said, return to your country and I'll deal well with you. So nothing wrong with us, reminding God of the promises that he's made to us. And so that's the way he starts off. What about next?
He humbles himself and he praises God's faithfulness.
Yeah, he humbles himself. I like this. I am not worthy of the least of all the mercies and of all the truth which you have shown your servant. That's awesome. And then he says, for I crossed over this Jordan with my staff, and now I have become two companies. So there's that wordplay again. Two companies or two camps. Okay, verse 11.
He's actually just straight up asking him, please deliver me,
But also my family as well.
Yeah. So he gets to the heart of the request here, which is he fears his brother Esau, he says, and he prays that God will deliver him and his family, as you said, Chris. Okay, and then last point, verse 12.
He reminds God again what he said.
Yeah. Starts with reminding God of the promise and ends with reminding God of the promise, right? So we'll just put all these up here. We've just walked through the prayer and said them all. So again, the longest prayer in Genesis, which is interesting. You might think that Abraham or Noah or somebody would have a longer prayer, but it's actually Jacob.
Is there a reason in verse 11 when it says, lest he come and attack me and the mother with the children, that why it just has singular?
Yeah, some commentators discuss that. It is rather curious that he says, lest he come and attack me. He doesn't say, and the mothers, but the mother with the children. And this may show a little bit of his selfish concern for Rachel. Although at this point, Rachel still only has one child, right? So why he says children, plural.
Well, I guess to technically own the other two.
It's true. She would own the children of her maid servant as well. So perhaps that's what he means. Yeah. Like I said, I know there's discussion in the commentaries about this, and I'm not sure, other than that explanation, that anyone has a very good explanation as to what Jacob means there. All right, you guys ready? So the third response here is for Jacob to send presents ahead to Esau. So let's read verses 13 through 21.
He spent the night there, and from what he had with him, he selected a gift for his brother Esau, 200 female goats and 20 male goats. 200 ewes and 20 rams, 30 female camels with their young, 40 cows and 10 bulls, and 20 female donkeys and 10 male donkeys. He put them in the care of his servants, each herd by itself, and said to the servants, "Go ahead of me and keep some space between the herds." He instructed the one in the lead, "When my brother Esau meets you and asks, 'Who do you belong to and where are you going and who owns all these animals in front of you?' then you are to say, 'They belong to your servant Jacob. They are a gift sent to my lord Esau, and he is coming behind us.'" He also instructed the second and the third and all the others who followed the herds, "You are to say the same thing to Esau when you meet him, and be sure to say, 'Your servant Jacob is coming behind us.'" For he thought, "I will pacify him with these gifts I am sending on ahead. Later, when I see him, perhaps he will receive me." So Jacob's gifts went on ahead of him, but he himself spent the night in the camp.
All right. So third response, to send presents on ahead, hoping to do what? Pacify him. Right. Right. So we've already discussed that the word present here is mincha, which is also a sacrificial term and can be translated offering. That's significant because there are several other words here that Jacob uses that sound like the context of a worshiper coming before God. The word to appease, he says, "I will appease him," verse 20, is literally to cover his face, and it's a word used in atonement. And so it's starting to look like Jacob is making an offering for his sin to Esau. Okay? Sending him an offering to make atonement for himself. Okay? Now, I want to give you a literal translation of verse 20 because the English could do this, but it's awkward in English. But you need to see what Jacob actually says here. And also say, "Look, your servant Jacob is behind us. For he said, 'I will cover his face with the offering that goes before my face. And after this, I will see his face. Perhaps he will lift up my face.'" So the word face is being used 4 times in this verse. First time, "I will cover his face." As we said, this is an expression that refers to atonement. And English translations use the word appease, and perhaps some of your translations have something else, but cover his face with the offering that goes before my face. After this, I will see his face. Perhaps he will lift up my face. What does it mean to have your face lifted up?
To be accepted.
To be accepted. So if you come before, whether it's God or a king or a superior, you're coming humbly with head down. And if that person raises your head, lifts your head, then that's a sign of acceptance. Okay? So Jacob says, perhaps he will lift up my face. Perhaps he will then accept, which is what the New King James says here. He will accept me. Okay, so this is all really interesting. This language is the language of a worshiper approaching God and seeking forgiveness. Okay, we want to hang on to that, and we'll talk more about it once we get into chapter 33. Do you guys have any other questions or thoughts on these verses? Okay, so we come to this next very interesting section, verses 22 through 32, where Jacob wrestles with this mysterious person. And by the way, before we read, response number 4 is that Jacob takes his family across the river. Okay, which we'll see here in a moment. Okay.
During the night, Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 servant wives, and his 11 sons, and crossed the Jabbok River with them. After taking them to the other side, he sent over all his possessions. This left Jacob all alone in the camp, and a man came and wrestled with him until the dawn began to break. When the man saw that he would not win the match, he touched Jacob's hip and wrenched it out of its socket. Then the man said, "Let me go, for the dawn is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." "What is your name?" the man asked. He replied, "Jacob." "Your name will no longer be Jacob," the man told him. "From now on you will be called Israel, because you have fought with God and with man and have won." "Please tell me your name," Jacob said. "Why do you want to know my name?" the man replied. Then he blessed Jacob there. Jacob named the place Peniel, which means face of God. For he said, "I have seen God face to face, yet my life has been spared." The sun was rising as Jacob left Peniel, and he was limping because of the injury to his hip. Even today, the people of Israel don't eat the tendon near the hip socket. It's what happened that night when the man strained the tendon of Jacob's hip.
Okay, thank you, Chris. All right, so Jacob has a pretty sleepless night here. Notice in verse 21 that he himself lodged that night in the camp. But then in verse 22, and he arose that night and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and 11 sons, and crossed over the ford of the Jabbok. So here he is, they've camped for the night, but he's restless, isn't he? He knows he's going to be meeting Esau, and he's concerned. So he gets up and he sends his family across the river. But apparently he stays on the other side. And while he's there, all of a sudden he's attacked. A man wrestled with him until the breaking of day. Now, before we start talking about this wrestling match, guess what? There's a bunch more word plays that happen in the story here in Hebrew. So Jacob has the family cross over the river. The word for crossover is avar in Hebrew. The B is pronounced like a V, avar, in this case. And the word servant is being used constantly in the story. Jacob refers to himself as Esau's servant. That's the word avad. So we have avar, avad. Jacob is about to enter into a wrestling match, and that is the word avak. His name is Yaakov in Hebrew. Notice a lot of the same consonants here. He's crossing over the Yabok, or the Jabbok River. And when he finally does meet Esau, Esau is going to chabak him, embrace him. So a lot of clever word plays. We've already had minha and mahaneh and hain, and now we have this word group with all these words that sound alike. Again, it's a great way of telling a story, because with all these word plays, it makes it very memorable, it makes it entertaining, and it also highlights then important ideas in the story through the wordplay. Okay, now talk to me about this wrestling match. What do you think about it? What's going on here?
My version just seems really intense because he's like, all of a sudden, these 2 dudes are just wrestling like in the middle of the night, and then it says that the man wrenched Jacob's hip out of the socket.
Okay.
It sounds pretty intense stuff.
So this is a very powerful man who can literally touch the socket of his hip and pull it out of joint. If Jacob didn't know who he was wrestling with before that, now he's got an idea, right? And yet this man who is so powerful that he can touch his hip and do this says, "Let me go." And Jacob says, "I won't let you go unless you bless me." So what's going on here? I thought this guy is more powerful than Jacob, but yet Jacob seems to be more powerful than him.
I just think it's cool that it kind of shows that, like, kind of Jacob's stubbornness, and God takes time to wrestle with him, even though obviously he's going because of God against man.
Yeah.
But like it's the surrender that like has Jacob win in the end. But that he just takes the time to deal with stubbornness. Is
Yeah.
often the cool part of
That's
the story.
nice. Yeah, God takes the time to deal with stubbornness. And there's a passage that I think we should read over in Hosea. Now, some of you guys are in the book of the 12, right? So you've covered this passage, and I think Clark chats a little bit about it. But Hosea actually mentions this incident and gives us a little bit of insight here into what is going on. So Hosea 12:4, whose turn? Well, let's just get someone who has it, Aoife, and that'll save you trying to find it. Okay, go ahead, Blake.
He strove with the angel and prevailed. He wept and sought his favor. He met God at Bethel, and there God spoke with us.
Okay, so he's talking here about Jacob. If you read the context, that's very clear. And in verse 4, Hosea says he struggled with the angel. So here's where we get the idea that this is the angel of God. And prevailed, but how did Jacob prevail according to what Hosea says here? He wept and sought favor from him. So it really wasn't Jacob's physical might, Hosea said. After all, no human being, as Aoife was saying, could defeat God. But he wept and sought his favor. This is how Jacob prevailed, okay? So it was his prayers, it was his pleading here. He says, I will not let you go unless you bless me. Jacob desperately wants the blessing of God, okay? We'll talk more about that in a moment. But how does the angel then go about blessing Jacob?
Hebrew names.
Okay, we have a name change. We've seen that before in the story, haven't we? With Father Abraham and with Sarah. So, but this is a greater change than what Abraham or Sarah experienced. This is a different name. So he calls him Israel, and there's a lot of discussion over exactly what the name Israel means. So I've got three different possible interpretations up here for you. God prevails, or God fights, or God struggles. Okay? And maybe it means a little bit of all of these, because God certainly struggles with his people. God fights on behalf of his people, and sometimes God has to fight against his people. And God always prevails. So maybe there is a sense in which all of these meanings are encapsulated in the name Israel. But what does the change of name then signify? Thinking back to Abraham. Yeah, change in character. Jacob up to this point has not been super likable. He's always out for himself. He's very deceptive. When he needs to assert himself, he's very passive, for instance, with his wives. We feel a bit sorry for him, the way Laban takes advantage of him, but he's still not that appealing of a character. But what we're beginning to see is him attributing all of his blessings to God, praying to God, thanking God, saying, God, you've given me everything. I have nothing without you. And now here, desperately wanting God's blessing, not Father Isaac's blessing, not stealing a blessing, but wanting the blessing directly from God himself. So we're seeing some changes, I think, in Jacob. What does he name the place? Peniel, which again is a hint here in the passage that he is seeing God, because Peniel, as Chris's translation points out, means face of God. So Peni in Hebrew is face and El is God. Now we just had verse 20 with all of this face language. You know, I'll cover my face with the present that goes before my face, and you know, to appease the face of Esau, etc. And maybe he'll lift up my face. And now we've got face again, face of God. Jacob says that I have seen God face to face, and my life has been preserved. So we have the face of the brother and we have the face of God. And again, we're not going to solve that little point just yet, but we want to keep that in mind when we head into chapter 33. So what happens then after Jacob gets the blessing? What happens?
Scarred for life, like he still has his limp and everything.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? He has this encounter with God and gets blessed by God, but he's also scarred for life. He has this debilitating limp. Notice throughout the narrative, we've been told the time of day again. What time was it when he crossed his family over the river and started wrestling with the angel? It was the night. What does night represent?
Sin, darkness.
Sin, fear, darkness, all of those things. So danger and fear, I think, are certainly things that Jacob is feeling. And he gets attacked in the middle of the night. But now, as he limps away, we're told the time of day again. What is it? The sun rose, right? What's the significance of that? Why are we being told the time of day again? Well, what's night and sunrise mean to you guys? It's a new day. Jacob has wrestled with God, and it says he has prevailed, and he has been blessed by God. So much of the danger and fear that he was experiencing the night before has been confronted, and as he limps away into a new day. He is a new person with a new name. Okay. Again, never take these little details in the story for granted. They're usually there to tell us something. Let's talk about some of the lessons that we can learn from this really interesting story. So what sort of speaks to you about Jacob's wrestling match with God? What are we to take from this?
I like that he fought for the blessing so hard.
He fought for the blessing.
He actively pursued it.
This is one of the things that I love about Jacob. We don't always approve of his methods, but all of his life, he's wanted the blessing. So, he sells some stew to his brother to get the birthright. He deceives his dad to get his dad's blessing. And now he wrestles with God. He desperately wants the blessing. Where Esau shows little concern about the blessing. He willingly sells his birthright. He does cry because his father doesn't give him the blessing, but then he marries the wrong women without consultation. And as we'll see here later on, he's content to leave the promised land and leave it to Jacob here in chapter 33, as we'll see. So in many ways, Jacob shows so much more passion for wanting the blessing. And I think there's a great lesson in that for us, how badly do we want God's blessing? God is a blessing God. He wants to bless us. But is it something that we're just like, if God wants to bless me, that's fine. But if not, I'm not going to worry about it. You know, are we apathetic about it? Something that we've slightly touched on already is that meeting with God doesn't result here in healing. In one sense, it does. Jacob's a new man, but it also results in crippling. And blessing does not come from strength, but in weakness. Jacob, the man who was blessed, is now crippled. So would you rather be uncrippled and unblessed, or would you rather encounter God even if it means crippling you so that you can be blessed? And again, Jacob wants the blessing so much that he'll be crippled, but he'll get the blessing. Okay. So I think it's a great question for us. Do we want to follow God even to the point of crippling? And what would that mean to us? Not necessarily that God puts us in a wheelchair, but in what ways could this apply to us? What's the crippling?
The surrender of something you deem to be important in your life.
Okay, surrendering something that you deem to be important in your life. Yeah, yeah. Are you willing to, like Abraham, take your son, your only son whom you love, Isaac? You know, are we willing to take the things that seem important to us and hand them over to God? And sometimes those things are things we need to give up because they're harmful for us. And in Jacob's case, he had a lot of flaws and weaknesses that he needed to hand over to God. He needed to stop trying to earn the blessing or stop trying to steal the blessing or get the blessing on his own. He needed to surrender to God and allow God then to bless him. So seeing God has brought a new power, and it's also brought a new weakness. And the Apostle Paul says, when I am weak, then I am strong. Paul might have known this story. I think he did. Now, the other thing that is interesting in this story, and we touched on this a little bit, is that God allows himself to be weak so that Jacob might prevail. How is God, Jacob going to prevail over God? Well, we've already said he can't. But God allows himself to be weak enough so that Jacob can prevail. Let me go. No, I won't let you go unless you bless me. Like God really has to ask Jacob to let him go. So this reminds us of Jesus, who was God in the flesh and was willing to become weak so that we might prevail. Humbled himself to the point of death, even death on a cross. And in that weakness, God displayed his power by raising him from the dead and having him ascend to the throne on high. So there's a great message here about human weakness, being willing to be weak so that God can be the strong one, so that we can rely on God's strength. Remember the Jacob who's removing stones from the well and showing how strong he is. But here it's his weakness, as Hosea says. He wept and he sought God with tears. So in his weakness, he actually becomes strong. And the once prayerless man now prevails against God and man through prayer. Again, he doesn't prevail in his own human strength, but through prayer. So those are just some of the things that I've learned in meditating on this story, reading various commentaries, people who've pointed out a lot of these great thoughts. Have you guys got any other thoughts as I put these up? Maybe something has struck you. Maybe it's not even anything new, but a comment maybe on something we've talked about here. This is a story I don't like to rush on from because it's a very powerful story. Okay. Well, we've got time to at least get into 33. I'm not sure if we'll get it finished, but we might. So now we've had Jacob encounter the angels, and then Jacob prepare to meet his brother, and now he's encountered the angel of God, and he's come out of that a blessed man, a new man in many ways. And now that he's had the wrestling match with God, he's finally ready to meet his brother. So that's what happens here in verses 1 through 11. So let's go ahead and read 1 through 11. Aoife, yeah, I think it's your turn.
Now Jacob lifted his eyes and looked, and there Esau was coming, and with him were 400 men. So he divided the children among Leah, Rachel, and the two maidservants. And he put the maidservants and their children in front, Leah and her children behind, and Rachel and Joseph last. Then he crossed over before them and bowed himself to the ground 7 times until he came near to his brother. But Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. And he lifted his eyes and saw the woman and children and said, "Who are these with you?" So he said, "The children whom God has graciously given your servant." Then the maidservants came near, they and their children, and bowed down. And Leah also came near with her children, and they bowed down. Afterward, Joseph and Rachel came near, and they bowed down. Then Esau said, "What do you mean by all this company which I met?" And he said, "These are to find favor in the sight of my Lord." But Esau said, "I have enough, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself." And Jacob said, "No, please, if I have now found favor in your sight, then receive my present from my hand, inasmuch as I have seen your face, as though I had seen the face of God, and you were pleased with me. Please take my blessing that is brought to you, because God has dealt graciously with me, and because I have enough." So he urged him, and he took it.
Okay. It's a great story, like happy endings. So Jacob sees his brother Esau coming, and what is it that he does?
He bows so much.
He bows down, so 7 times, continues to show a humility, right? What else?
It's his least favorite wives.
Yeah, he puts the family in the order of his least favorite to his favorite, right? So some of the old Jacob is still around, but one difference is that Jacob leads his family. He goes at the front. So if Esau is going to attack, Jacob's going to be the first one to die. And then Rachel and Joseph are at the end, and he's hoping that they can still escape. So we see changes, but we still see hints of the old guy, and that's true of all of us, right? God comes into our lives, He blesses us, He changes us, but all of the old things are not totally gone out of our life immediately. We still have to grow in our relationship with the Lord. So as you guys have mentioned, he shows great humility here, bowing 7 times, which is a customary approach to a king, many scholars say. So that's interesting. And this, we've already mentioned this idea, but this is ironic because it's a reversal of Isaac's blessing, that Jacob's brother would bow down to him. Instead, Jacob's the one doing the bowing down and calling him my Lord. In fact, in this story, Esau calls Jacob my brother, but Jacob continues to call Esau my Lord. Okay. So tell me about Esau's reaction here. He what? He missed his brother. Yeah. How does this make you feel about Esau when you read verse 4?
Just seemed like he matured a lot.
Yeah.
Kind of
foolish, youthful stuff behind him.
Yeah, there's a lot of growth and maturity here. No longer does he want to kill his brother, right? He runs to meet him. He's so anxious. Sorry, like reminds you of the prodigal son, doesn't it? Where the father runs to meet the prodigal son. Esau runs to meet him and embraces him and falls on his neck and kisses him, and they weep. So, we might have had some bad feelings about Esau in the past. He sells his birthright. He's kind of a gruff guy. He marries Canaanite women, and when that doesn't please his parents, he thinks, I'll marry Ishmael's daughter, and that doesn't work either. And then he wants to murder his brother. But when you read all of this, you're like, wow, this is really cool. This guy has experienced a transformation. And we'll see some of why that transformation takes place in what Esau says later. So Jacob introduces the whole family to him because he asks, who are these? Which is a formal way of saying, introduce me to your family. The only names that are mentioned are Leah, Rachel, and Joseph. That doesn't mean that Jacob doesn't introduce them all by name, but here in the text, only those three names are specifically mentioned. So Joseph's the only child mentioned, which kind of is already a big hint that he's Jacob's favorite, which will be told in a few chapters from now. And then Esau uses one of our favorite words in verse 8. What do you mean by all this company? So there's our word camp again, which I met. And he's talking about all the gifts that had been sent ahead by Jacob. And Jacob says in verse 8, these are to find favor or grace in the sight of my Lord. You got to like Esau's response to this too, right? He doesn't say, well, you owe it to me. Okay. He says, I have enough, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself. Tell me about Jacob's response in verse 10 and 11.
I love that he says, please accept my blessing
Ooh,
after he's stolen his blessing.
yeah, that's a real key. So first he says, receive my present from my hand in verse 10, but then verse 11, please take my blessing. That's a very obvious reference to I'm saying I'm sorry, I'm trying to make up for what I did to you years ago. And no doubt that word hit Esau's heart and leads him to then accepting the gift. Now, what is one of the things that Jacob says to Esau besides this gift and blessing?
He compares seeing his face to seeing God's face.
Yeah, okay. So we saw this whole idea back in chapter 32, this language of face, as he prepared to meet Esau. And then we saw Jacob wrestle with God and name the place Peniel, face of God, because I saw God and lived. And now we have this language of bringing the brother and God together in this face language. Seeing your face is like seeing the face of God. So Jacob has brought a sacrifice for atonement, and he's asked for grace. This is what someone who's coming to God would do. Esau has forgiven and accepted him. All the terms in the story are terms of sacrifice. Thus, Jacob has approached Esau as one would God. And Esau has acted like God in forgiving Jacob instead of putting him to death as he deserved. So this is why the face of God and the face of Esau are equated here. And this reminds me of the New Testament teaching that anyone who says they love God but does not love their brother is a liar. He who loves God loves his brother also. So if there's going to be reconciliation with God, there has to be reconciliation with the brother. And that's what we have in this story. In reverse order, first there's the reconciliation with God, and then there's the reconciliation with the brother. I love this story as much as I love the one of wrestling with the angel, because I just think it's a beautiful ending to the drama here of what's Esau going to do, and to see his graciousness toward Jacob and Jacob's insistence of he can't totally make up for the wrong that he did, but to offer this offering as a means of atonement and to seek grace from Esau and to be given it by Esau. You guys have any other thoughts in these verses?
It makes me wonder what happened to Esau. Like, did God come talk to him? Because he obviously has some major change.
Yeah.
But we talked about it a little bit.
I think one thing that we see here in the story is that Esau says, I have enough, my brother. So he's acknowledging the fact that God's really blessed him. So in spite of this horrible blessing that Isaac gave to Esau, God has been faithful to Esau and blessed him with much. And in the next few verses, we're going to see how Esau has actually moved to another part of the country, to Seir, which is down in what later becomes the country of Edom. And so God has blessed him with a land, and he has blessed him with a lot of wealth. And when we get to chapter 36, we'll see he blessed him with a lot of kids too, and a kingdom. So yeah. I think we have enough time to finish this next section here, maybe to finish the chapter. So let's read 12 through 17.
Then Esau said, let us journey on our way, and I will go ahead of you. But Jacob said to him, my Lord knows that the children are frail, and that the nursing flocks and herds are a care to me. If they are driven hard for one day, the flocks will die. Let my Lord pass on ahead of his servant, and I will lead on slowly, at the pace of the livestock that are ahead of me, and at the pace of the children, until I come to my Lord in Seir. So Esau said, let me lead with you some of the people who are with me. But he said, what need is there? Let me find favor in the sight of my Lord. So Esau returned that day on his way to Seir. But Jacob journeyed to Succoth and built himself a house and made booths for his livestock. Therefore, the name of this place is called Succoth.
Okay, to me, this is just a bit of a sad ending, but it has to sort of happen for the brothers to part. But Esau wants to help Jacob, hang out with him, and Jacob seems to be kind of uncomfortable with the whole thing, right? So he first of all makes the excuse, well, we can't travel as fast as you guys would travel. So, well, then let me leave some people for you to protect you. But if he does that, then he's obligated to go visit Esau, because Esau's men will be with him, and he really doesn't want to go visit Esau. It's just an excuse saying, I'll come to my Lord in Seir. And I think Esau finally gets that when Jacob says, what need is there? Let me find favor in your sight. So in one sense, it's sort of sad that there's still this uncomfortableness that Jacob feels with Esau. In verse 17, he journeys to this place. In Hebrew, it's called Sukkot, which does mean booths. This is the name of the Feast of Tabernacles, right? They call it Sukkot today. And it says he builds for himself a house and booths for the livestock. And therefore it's called Sukkot, or booths, because of the booths that Jacob built. But notice he built himself a house here, which means he settles down in this area for a while. Now he's across the River Jordan still. He's not in Canaan yet. So he's in land that will later be given to Israel, but he has not crossed over the Jordan yet into Canaan proper. So just reflecting on these chapters, if we look back over chapters 31 to 33, we notice that there's two triangles going on in these stories. We have Jacob, Laban, and God, and we have Jacob, Esau, and God. And with the human characters, Jacob and Laban and Jacob and Esau, there's conflict. And Jacob even has conflict with God. But in the end, God resolves all of the conflict. He sees to it that Jacob is protected from Laban. He resolves the conflict between himself and Jacob. And finally, he blesses the reunion of Jacob and Esau. So it's pretty cool. I think we'll stop there because the last few verses actually start to take up a new story. So this is a good place to stop. This is where the brothers part company. So great. God bless you guys. Have a good rest of the evening, and we'll see you tomorrow.